The crystal ballroom looked like something straight out of a fairy tale that Tuesday evening. Golden light poured down from massive chandeliers that probably cost more than most people's cars. The marble floor sparkled so clean you could see your reflection, and the walls were decorated with paintings that belonged in museums. Tonight wasn't just any night. This was Chicago's biggest charity event of the year, and everyone who was anyone had shown up. Rich businessmen in expensive suits chatted with their wives, who wore dresses that probably took months to design. Jewelry caught the light as women laughed at jokes that weren't really funny, but everyone pretended they were, because that's how these things worked. The smell of expensive perfume mixed with the aroma of gourmet food being prepared in the kitchen. Waiters in crisp white shirts moved around like dancers, carrying silver trays and making sure every glass stayed full. At the center of all this fancy display stood Viktor Kozlov, and boy did he know he was the star of the show. This Russian pianist had fingers that could make a piano sing like an angel, and he never let anyone forget it. His black hair was slicked back perfectly, and his tuxedo looked like it was sewn onto his body. Victor had played in the biggest concert halls around the world: Carnegie Hall in New York, the Royal Opera House in London, places where tickets cost more than some people make in a month. Tonight, everyone wanted to talk to him. Rich ladies with too much makeup giggled at his stories about playing for royalty in Europe. Business owners shook his hand and told him how honored they were to meet such a talented artist. Victor ate up every word of praise like he was starving for it. His chest puffed out with pride every time someone mentioned his latest album, which had shot to #1 on the classical music charts faster than anyone expected. But while all this glamour was happening in the main dining room, a completely different world existed just 30 feet away behind the kitchen doors. The contrast couldn't have been more dramatic if someone had planned it that way. In the hot, steamy kitchen, Maria Santos was tying her black apron around her waist and getting ready for what she knew would be the longest night of her week. 28 years old, she had the kind of quiet beauty that people noticed but never made a big deal about. Her dark hair was pulled back in a simple ponytail, and her hands showed the evidence of someone who worked hard for everything she had. Small calluses dotted her fingertips, and a thin scar on her thumb told the story of a busy night when she'd been moving too fast with a broken glass. Maria had been working at the Crystal Ballroom for 3 years now, ever since she'd moved to Chicago with her younger brother Diego. People always assumed she was just another waitress trying to make ends meet, and in some ways they were right. But they had no idea about the rest of her story, the part she kept locked away like a treasure she couldn't afford to lose. Every morning, Maria woke up at 5:30 in their small apartment on the south side of the city. She'd make breakfast for Diego, who was 22 but needed extra help because of his developmental challenges. He had the sweetest smile in the world and could remember every single movie he'd ever watched. But simple tasks like managing money or getting to work on time were still hard for him. Maria didn't mind taking care of him. Actually, she loved it. Diego was the only family she had left, and she'd do anything to make sure he was safe and happy. After getting Diego ready for his job at the local grocery store, Maria would head to her morning shift at a coffee shop downtown. She'd serve hundreds of cups of coffee to business people who barely looked at her face, then rush home to check on Diego before heading to the Crystal Ballroom for the evening shift. It wasn't an easy life, but it was theirs, and Maria had learned to find joy in small moments. What none of the fancy guests upstairs knew, what none of her coworkers knew either, was that Maria's calloused hands had once moved across piano keys with the grace of a professional dancer. Those same fingers that now carried heavy trays had once brought audiences to their feet with standing ovations. But that felt like a lifetime ago, back when her dreams were bigger than her responsibilities. As Maria finished tying her apron, She could hear the sound of classical music drifting down from the main dining room. Her heart did a little skip. When she recognized the melody, it was Chopin, one of the composers she'd studied for years at the conservatory. She paused for just a moment, letting the familiar notes wash over her like an old friend's voice. Then she shook her head, grabbed her order pad, and pushed through the swinging doors into the world of crystal glasses and polite conversation. The contrast hit her like stepping into a different universe. The kitchen had been all stainless steel and rushing around, but the dining room was soft lighting and quiet voices. Guests sat at tables covered with white cloth, so fine it probably cost more than Maria's monthly rent. Every fork and knife was polished to perfection, and the flowers in the center of each table looked like they'd been arranged by artists. Maria moved through this world with practiced ease, even though she never quite felt like she belonged in it. She'd learned how to smile politely when guests treated her like she was invisible, how to keep her face neutral when they talked about spending more money on a single dinner than she made in 2 weeks. Most of the time, the guests were polite enough. They might not remember her name or look her in the eye, but they weren't usually mean about it. Tonight felt different, though. Maybe it was the way the music kept pulling at something deep in her chest, or maybe it was the way Victor Kozlov's laughter carried across the room like he owned the entire world. There was something about his confidence that reminded Maria of a life she used to dream about, back when she thought her biggest problem would be choosing between concert halls, instead of choosing between paying the electric bill or buying groceries. As she filled water glasses and took orders for appetizers, Maria found herself stealing glances at the grand piano sitting in the corner of the room. It was a beautiful instrument, a black Steinway that probably cost more than Maria would make in 5 years. The lid was closed tonight since Victor had finished his performance, but Maria could almost see the keys underneath, waiting patiently for someone to bring them back to life. She wondered if the piano ever got lonely, sitting there looking pretty, but staying silent most of the time. It was probably used to being admired, but not played, like a fancy sports car that spent most of its time in a garage. The thought made her sadder than it should have. Maria shook off the feeling and focused on her work. She had tables to serve and money to earn. Diego was counting on her, and dreams were luxuries she couldn't afford right now. But as she moved through the evening, carrying trays and refilling glasses, she couldn't shake the feeling that something important was about to happen. She just had no idea how right she was. The evening was flowing smoothly until everything changed in the span of just a few minutes. Maria had been moving between tables like she always did, making sure everyone had what they needed. Her feet were starting to ache in her black work shoes, but she kept her smile bright and professional. She'd learned long ago that good tips came from good service, and every dollar mattered when you were trying to make rent and keep food on the table. Around 9 o'clock, she got the order that would change her entire night. Table 7, Victor's table had requested a bottle of their finest red wine. It was a 2015 Bordeaux that cost more than Maria made in 3 days, but she'd served expensive bottles before. She knew how to handle the fancy stuff without making a fool of herself. As she approached Victor's table carrying the wine bottle and proper glasses, something strange happened. The pianist was talking loudly about his recent performance in Vienna, gesturing wildly with his hands as he described the standing ovation he'd received. But Maria barely heard his words because her attention was completely captured by something else. The soft background music playing through the restaurant's sound system. It was Chopin's ballade, No One in G minor, and hearing it was like getting punched in the stomach and hugged at the same time. Maria's steps slowed down without her meaning to. This piece had been her favorite during her 3rd year at the conservatory. She'd practiced it for months, spending hours every day working on the tricky passages until her fingers moved across the keys like they were dancing. Her old teacher, Professor Williams, had told her that her interpretation of this particular piece was something special, something that showed real understanding of the music's soul. Standing there with the wine bottle in her hands, Maria could almost feel those piano keys under her fingertips again. She remembered the way the melody would build and flow, how it started so gentle and then exploded into something passionate and heartbreaking. For just a moment, she forgot where she was. She forgot about her aching feet and her empty bank account, and the way some of these rich people looked right through her like she was invisible. That's when Victor noticed her standing there, and his mood changed completely. "Excuse me," he said, his Russian accent making every word sound sharp and cunning. "Are you planning to serve that wine sometime tonight? Or are you just going to stand there staring into space?" Maria snapped back to reality, her cheeks burning with embarrassment. "I'm so sorry, sir. I was just—" "You were just what?" Victor's voice got louder, and Maria could feel other people at nearby tables starting to turn and look. "Daydreaming? Do you think this is the place for that kind of unprofessional behavior?" The other people at Victor's table looked uncomfortable, shifting in their seats and exchanging glances. One woman in a sparkly blue dress tried to change the subject by asking Victor about his upcoming tour, but he was on a roll now and didn't want to stop. "You know what your problem is?" Victor continued, leaning back in his chair like he was settling in for a long speech. "You people don't understand what it means to take pride in your work. You think showing up is enough, but real professionals, real artists, we understand that excellence requires focus and dedication." Maria's hands were shaking slightly as she began to pour the wine, being extra careful not to spill a single drop. She'd dealt with rude customers before, but something about this felt different. Maybe it was the way he kept saying, "you people," like she was part of some group that was naturally inferior to him. Or maybe it was the way the Chopin was still playing in the background, reminding her of everything she used to be. "I really am sorry, sir," she said quietly, trying to keep her voice steady. "The wine is excellent, and I hope you enjoy." "Oh, I'm sure you're very sorry," Victor interrupted, his voice dripping with sarcasm. "But sorry doesn't fix anything, does it? You see, this is exactly what I'm talking about. Some people are born to create beauty in this world, and others ... He gestured dismissively at Maria's uniform. "Others are born to serve those who create beauty." The woman in the blue dress looked like she wanted to disappear under the table. "Victor, perhaps we should—" No, let me finish," he said, holding up his hand. "This is important. You see, I've spent my entire life mastering my craft. 20 years of practice, 10 hours a day. I've performed in the greatest concert halls in the world. I've played for presidents and kings. My hands have touched keys that Mozart himself once played." He picked up his wine glass and took a sip, then nodded approvingly. At least the wine met his standards, even if everything else about his evening was apparently disappointing him. "But you," he continued, pointing at Maria, "you probably think that classical music is just pretty background noise for rich people's dinner parties. You probably couldn't tell the difference between Chopin and some pop song on the radio." Maria felt something cold settle in her stomach. If only he knew. If only he knew that she could play that Chopin piece he was probably thinking about. If only he knew that she'd spent countless hours studying the same composers he name-dropped so casually. If only he knew that her fingers had once moved across piano keys with the same precision and passion that his did. But she didn't say any of that. She just stood there, holding the wine bottle, feeling smaller and smaller as he continued his lecture. "You see, true artistry, true understanding of music, is not something you can just pick up. It takes years of training, years of sacrifice. It takes a certain kind of mind, a certain kind of soul. Some people have it, And some people? He shrugged, like the conclusion was obvious by now. Half the dining room was watching this scene unfold. Maria could feel their eyes on her, some looking curious, others looking embarrassed for her. A few people seemed annoyed with Victor for making such a scene, but nobody was brave enough to tell him to stop. The problem with your generation, Victor went on, apparently not caring that he was ruining everyone else's evening, is that you think everything should be easy. You think appreciation for art just happens naturally. But real culture, real sophistication, that has to be earned. Maria finished pouring the wine for the other guests at the table, her movements careful and precise despite the way her hands were trembling. She wanted to run back to the kitchen and hide, but she had a job to do. She had bills to pay and a brother depending on her. "Will there be anything else?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Victor looked at her like he was seeing her. For the first time, really seeing her. Actually, yes. Next time, try to pay attention to what you're doing. Some of us are here to enjoy an evening of culture and refinement. We don't need distractions from people who clearly don't understand what that means. As Maria walked away from the table, she could hear Victor's voice behind her, already moving on to some story about his performance at Carnegie Hall. The other guests were being polite, making the right interested noises, but she could tell. They were uncomfortable with what had just happened. The worst part wasn't even the public humiliation, though that stung plenty. The worst part was the way Victor had dismissed her entire existence based on her uniform and her job. He'd looked at her and seen nothing but a servant, someone so far beneath him that she couldn't possibly understand the beauty and complexity of the music that had once been the center of her entire world. But Victor had made one very big mistake. He'd assumed that clothes and jobs and social status told the whole story about a person. He'd assumed that Maria was exactly what she appeared to be on the surface, nothing more and nothing less. He was about to learn just how wrong assumptions could be. Maria barely made it to the staff break room before the tears started falling. She pushed through the swinging doors into the back area of the restaurant, past the dishwashers who were too busy to notice her distress, and finally collapsed onto one of the plastic chairs in the small room where employees took their breaks. The break room wasn't much to look at, just a few mismatched chairs around a wobbly table, a microwave that only worked half the time, and a bulletin board covered with work schedules and safety reminders. But right now, it felt like the only safe place in the world. Maria put her head in her hands and let herself cry for the first time in months. It wasn't just about what Victor had said, though his words still echoed in her ears like a broken record. Some people are born to create beauty, and others are born to serve those who create beauty. The way he'd looked at her, like she was something he'd scrape off his shoe. The way he'd assumed she couldn't possibly understand real music, real art, real culture. If only he knew the truth. If only any of them knew. Maria wiped her eyes with the back of her hand and tried to pull herself together. She still had 3 hours left on her shift, and there were tables waiting to be served. But sitting there in that dingy break room, she couldn't stop thinking about everything that had led her to this moment. 5 years ago, she'd been a completely different person. Maria Santos, star student at the Chicago Conservatory of Music. Her professors had called her gifted, maybe even brilliant. She'd won competitions, earned scholarships, and had been on track for a career that most musicians could only dream about. The plan had been simple: graduate with honors, maybe do a year of advanced study in Europe, then start building a name for herself in the classical music world. But life had a way of changing plans, whether you wanted it to or not. She remembered the phone call that changed everything. It was a Tuesday afternoon, and she'd just finished practicing for 4 hours straight, working on a piece by Rachmaninoff that was giving her trouble. Her hands were tired but happy, the way they always felt after a good practice session. Then her phone rang, and her whole world fell apart in the space of a single conversation. Her father had been in a car accident. Not just any accident, the kind that left families devastated and futures uncertain. He'd been driving home from his second job, the night shift at a warehouse that helped pay for Maria's expensive education. A drunk driver had run a red light, and just like that, the man who'd worked himself to exhaustion to support his children's dreams was gone. Maria's mother had tried to be strong, but losing her husband broke something inside her that never quite healed. Within 6 months, she was showing signs of the depression that would eventually make it impossible for her to work. That left Maria as the only one who could take care of Diego, her younger brother, who needed constant support and supervision. Choice hadn't really been a choice at all. Drop out of school and get a job, or watch her family fall apart completely. Some people might have tried to find a third option, but Maria had never been the kind of person to gamble with other people's well-being. She'd packed up her dreams, along with her sheet music, and started looking for work. Those first few months had been the hardest of her life. Going from spending her days surrounded by beautiful music to spending them carrying trays and wiping down tables felt like losing a part of her soul. Her hands, which had been trained to create something magical, were suddenly just tools for getting through the day. But she'd adapted, the way people do when they have to. She'd learned to find small joys in her new life. Diego's smile when she brought home his favorite ice cream, the satisfaction of paying bills on time, the quiet pride of taking care of the people she loved. It wasn't the life she'd planned, but it was a good life in its own way, at least. That's what she'd been telling herself for 3 years. Tonight, though, sitting in that break room with Victor's cruel words still ringing in her ears, Maria felt something she hadn't felt in a long time. Anger. Pure, hot anger at the unfairness of it all. "Hey, you okay in here?" The voice belonged to Tommy, one of the other servers. He was a good guy, maybe 25 years old, who was working his way through law school. He'd seen her rush past the kitchen and had followed her to make sure she was all right. "I'm fine," Maria said automatically, then shook her head. "No, actually, I'm not fine at all." Tommy sat down in the chair across from her. "Was it that piano guy? I heard him giving you a hard time out there. What a complete jerk." "You don't understand," Maria said, and fresh tears started falling. "He was talking about music like I'm too stupid to understand it. Like I'm just some waitress who couldn't possibly appreciate art or culture or anything beautiful. So, who cares what some stuck-up musician thinks about you?" But that was just it. Maria did care, and she cared more than she wanted to admit. Because Victor wasn't completely wrong about her being just a waitress. That's what she was now. What she'd been for 3 years. All those hours of practice, all that training, all those dreams. What did any of it matter if nobody knew about it? He said some people are born to create beauty, and others are born to serve, Maria said, her voice getting stronger as she talked. Like it's just natural law or something. Like God decided I was meant to carry his wine while he gets to play piano for crowds of people who worship him. Tommy looked confused. "I mean, yeah, he's obviously a snob, but why are you taking it so personally?" Maria looked at him for a long moment, then made a decision she hadn't even realized she was considering. "Because I can play piano better than he can." The words came out quietly, almost like a confession. She'd never told anyone at work about her background. It felt too much like bragging, or maybe too much like admitting to a failure that was too big to explain. Tommy's eyebrows shot up. "Wait, what? You play piano?" "I used to. I was studying at the conservatory before." She gestured vaguely, not wanting to get into the whole sad story. "I was good, Tommy. Really good. I won competitions. I had professors telling me I could have a real career. Holy crap, Tommy said, leaning back in his chair. So when that guy was lecturing you about music, ... He was lecturing someone who probably knows more about classical music than most of the people in that dining room, Maria finished, including him. They sat in silence for a moment, both of them processing this information. Maria felt strange, having said it out loud. For 3 years, she'd kept her musical background like a secret shame, something that belonged to her old life that didn't fit into her new one. You know what you should do? Tommy said finally. You should march out there and tell him exactly who he's dealing with. Maria laughed, but it wasn't a happy sound. Right. And then what? Show him my dropout paperwork? Tell him about how I threw away my chance at a real career? You didn't throw anything away, Tommy said firmly. You made a choice to take care of your family. That's not throwing anything away. That's being a hero. The word hit Maria like a punch to the chest. Hero. She'd never thought of herself that way. Heroes were people who saved lives or fought wars or did something important with their existence. She just served food and tried to pay rent on time. But maybe Tommy had a point. Maybe there was more than one way to be important in the world. As they sat there talking, Maria could hear the sound of classical music drifting in from the dining room. The evening's entertainment was winding down, but the background music continued. Probably another Chopin piece, or maybe some Mozart. Music that she understood not just with her brain, but with every fiber of her being. Suddenly, an idea started forming in her mind. It was crazy, absolutely insane, and would probably get her fired. But sitting there in that break room, with Victor's dismissive words still echoing in her head, and 3 years of suppressed dreams demanding to be heard, Maria realized she didn't care about the consequences anymore. She stood up and smoothed down her apron, checking her reflection in the cracked mirror hanging on the wall. Her eyes were still red from crying, but there was something else there now, a determination that she hadn't felt in years. Where are you going? Tommy asked, seeing the change in her expression. Maria looked at him and smiled, really smiled. For the first time all evening. I'm going to remind someone that you can't judge a book by its cover. She walked out of that break room with her head held high, heading back toward the dining room where Victor was probably still holding court, telling stories about his brilliant career to people who hung on his every word. He had no idea what was coming for him. Maria walked back into the dining room with her heart pounding so hard she could hear it in her ears. The elegant space looked exactly the same as it had 20 minutes ago, but everything felt different now. The soft lighting that had seemed warm before now felt like spotlights. The quiet conversations that had been background noise now sounded like whispers about her. But none of that mattered anymore. She had made her decision. Victor was still at his table, still the center of attention, still talking with that confident voice that carried across the room like he owned the place. He was telling some story about performing at the Royal Opera House in London, gesturing with his wine glass and pausing at just the right moments to let his audience react with impressed murmurs. Maria's eyes moved past him to the grand piano, sitting in the corner. It was a beautiful Steinway, probably worth more than she'd make in 10 years. The black surface gleamed under the soft lights, and the lid was closed, making it look like a sleeping giant waiting to be awakened. She'd walked past that piano hundreds of times over the past 3 years. Sometimes she'd let her fingers brush against its smooth surface when no one was looking, remembering what it felt like to make music instead of just serving food. But she'd never imagined actually sitting down and playing it. That would have been crossing a line that seemed impossible to cross, until tonight. Maria took a deep breath and started walking toward the piano. Her legs felt shaky, like she was walking on a tightrope instead of solid ground. Part of her brain was screaming that this was a terrible idea. that she was about to make a fool of herself in front of all these important people. But another part of her, the part that had been quiet for 3 years, was finally wide awake and ready to be heard. The first person to notice her was a woman in a red dress sitting at table 12. She watched with curious eyes as Maria approached the piano, probably wondering why a waitress was heading toward the expensive instrument. Instead of taking care of customers, Maria reached the piano and stood there for a moment, her hand resting on the smooth wood. She could feel the vibrations from people's conversations through the floor, could smell the expensive perfume and wine that filled the air. This was really happening. After 3 years of silence, she was about to let her musical voice speak. Again, she lifted the lid of the piano, revealing the black and white keys that had once been as familiar to her as her own fingers. They looked perfect, like they'd been waiting patiently for someone who truly understood them. Maria sat down on the bench and adjusted it to the right height, muscle memory taking over even after all this time. The conversations around the room continued, but a few more people had noticed her now. A businessman at table 6 glanced over with a confused expression. A couple near the window stopped talking mid-sentence to stare. But Victor was still deep in his story about London, completely unaware that anything unusual was happening. Maria placed her fingers on the keys and felt something electric run through her body. It was like coming home after a long, difficult journey. These keys didn't care that she was wearing a waitress uniform or that she smelled like the kitchen. They only cared about the music she could make with them. She started with a single note, soft and gentle, letting it ring out into the room. And another note, and another, building the opening of Rachmaninoff's Piano Concerto No. 2. It was one of the most challenging pieces in the classical repertoire, the kind of music that separated serious pianists from people who just played. For fun, the opening notes were deceptively simple, almost like a question being asked. But Maria knew what was coming next, and her fingers were ready for it. As the melody began to unfold, something magical started happening in the dining room. Conversations didn't stop all at once. It was more gradual than that. First, the people sitting closest to the piano started to notice that something special was happening. The music wasn't just background noise anymore. It was too complex, too beautiful, too perfectly executed to ignore. A woman at table 3 put down her fork and turned in her chair to get a better look at the piano. The businessman who'd been checking his phone slipped it back into his pocket and focused on them all. Music. Slowly, like ripples spreading across a pond, the attention of the entire room began to shift toward Maria. Victor was still talking, but his voice was starting to compete with the piano, and the piano was winning. The piece was building now. Maria's fingers dancing across the keys with a precision and passion that spoke of years of dedicated training. This wasn't someone who'd learned to play from YouTube videos or taken a few casual lessons. This was the work of a serious musician. Not by the time Maria reached the first major crescendo, half the room had stopped eating to listen. The music was so beautiful, so emotionally powerful, that it seemed to grab people by the heart and demand their attention. An elderly gentleman near the back of the room had tears in his eyes. A young couple held hands as they listened, both of them completely mesmerized. Victor's voice trailed off in the middle of his sentence about the London critics. He turned in his chair to see what was capturing everyone's attention, and his face went completely white when he saw Maria at the piano. But Maria wasn't paying attention to Victor anymore. She was lost in the music, her body swaying with the melody as her fingers flew across the keys. The technical passages that would have stumped most pianists flowed from her hands like water. The emotional sections sang with a depth of feeling that comes only from someone who has truly lived, who has experienced both joy and heartbreak. The entire room was silent, now except for the soaring music. Guests had turned their chairs to face the piano, their expensive meals forgotten. Some had their mouths open in shock. Others were wiping away tears. The music was telling a story of dreams and loss, of struggle and hope, of beauty, that refuses to be silenced, no matter how hard life tries to quiet it. Maria's technique was flawless, but more than that, her interpretation was breathtaking. She wasn't just playing the notes on the page. She was pouring her heart out through the piano, letting 3 years of suppressed emotion flow through her fingers. Every phrase was perfect. Every dynamic change was exactly right. Every moment of the piece was given the attention and respect it deserved. Victor sat frozen in his chair, his wine glass halfway to his lips, staring at the woman he had dismissed and humiliated just an hour earlier. The woman he had assumed couldn't possibly understand. Real music was playing one of the most difficult pieces in the classical repertoire, with a skill and artistry that rivaled his own. Actually, if he was being honest with himself, and the music was too beautiful for him to lie to himself right now, she was playing it better than he could. Her interpretation had a depth and emotional honesty that his performances sometimes lacked. While he played to impress audiences and critics, Maria was playing to express something true and real about the human experience. The other guests at Victor's table had forgotten he existed. They were completely absorbed in Maria's performance, their faces showing the kind of awe that people feel when they witness something truly extraordinary. One woman had pulled out her phone and was recording, though she was so captivated by the music that she forgot to actually start the video. Maria moved into the final section of the piece. The music became even more powerful. Her fingers seemed to barely touch the keys, yet the sound she was producing filled every corner of the room. The melody soared and dipped, whispered and roared, painting pictures in the air that everyone could see and feel. The technical passages that should have been impossible for someone who hadn't practiced in years flowed from her hands like she'd been preparing for this moment her entire life. And maybe she had been. Maybe every hour of practice in her conservatory days, every competition she'd won, every dream she'd had to put aside. Maybe it had all been leading to this moment when she could finally show the world who she really was. As the final notes of the concerto echoed through the stunned silence of the dining room, Maria lifted her hands from the keys and sat perfectly still. She had poured everything into that performance, all her training, all her passion, all her pain, and all her joy. She felt empty and full at the same time, exhausted and energized, like she had just run a marathon and won. The silence that followed was unlike anything anyone in that room had ever experienced. It wasn't the absence of sound. It was the presence of something so powerful that words would have been an insult to it. The silence stretched on for what felt like forever. Maria sat at the piano, her hands still resting on the keys, not quite believing what she had just done. Her heart was racing, but for the first time in 3 years, it wasn't from fear or stress. It was from the pure joy of making music again. Then, from somewhere in the back of the room, came the sound of slow clapping. One person, then another, then suddenly the entire dining room erupted in applause that was unlike anything Maria had ever experienced. It wasn't just polite dinner party clapping. This was the kind of applause that comes from deep in the soul, when people have witnessed something that touches them in a way they didn't expect. People weren't just clapping, they were standing up, one by one, until the entire room was on their feet. The elderly gentleman who had been crying during her performance was now openly weeping, his hands shaking as he applauded. The young couple near the window were holding each other, both of them beaming with joy. Even the waitstaff had emerged from the kitchen to see what was happening, and they were clapping too, huge smiles on their faces. But Maria's eyes found Victor across the room, and what she saw there surprised her. The arrogant pianist, who had humiliated her an hour earlier, looked like a completely different person. His face was pale, his mouth slightly open, and his eyes held a mixture of shock, shame, and something that might have been respect. The applause continued for several minutes, with some people shouting, "Bravo!" and "Incredible." Maria felt tears running down her cheeks, but they were happy tears this time. She stood up from the piano bench and gave a small bow. Overwhelmed by the response. As the applause finally began to die down, Victor slowly rose from his chair. Maria watched him cross the room toward her, and for a moment she wondered if he was coming to yell at her for interrupting his evening. But when he reached the piano, his expression was completely different from the one he'd worn earlier. Victor started, then stopped, seemingly at a loss for words. "I owe you the biggest apology of my life." His Russian accent was still there, but the arrogance was completely gone. He looked genuinely humbled, maybe even a little bit broken by what he had just witnessed. "That performance," he continued, his voice quiet enough that only Maria and the people standing nearby could hear him. "That was extraordinary. Where did you study?" Maria wiped the tears from her cheeks and looked at this man who had been so cruel to her earlier. She could have been angry, could have thrown his harsh words back in his face. But seeing him standing there, clearly struggling with the realization of how wrong he had been, she felt something unexpected, pity. "Juilliard," she said simply. "I was there for 3 years before I had to leave." The word hit Victor like a physical blow. Juilliard wasn't just any music school. It was one of the most prestigious conservatories in the world. Getting accepted, there was like winning the lottery, except it required incredible talent instead of luck. And Maria had not only gotten in, but had clearly thrived there. 3 years at Juilliard, Victor repeated, shaking his head. "And you've been working here as a waitress," Maria finished for him. "Because sometimes life doesn't go according to plan. Sometimes you have to choose between your dreams and your family, and family wins." A small crowd had gathered around them now. Other guests who had been moved by Maria's performance wanted to hear this conversation, sensing that there was more to the story. Victor seemed to notice them for the first time and looked embarrassed by the public nature of his apology. "I said terrible things to you," he said, his voice getting stronger. "I made assumptions about who you are based on your job, your appearance. I acted like music was something you couldn't possibly understand, when clearly," he gestured toward the piano, "when clearly you understand it better than most people ever will." Maria could see that this was hard for him. Victor was obviously a man who was used to being the smartest person in the room, the most talented, the most worthy of respect. Having to admit that he had been completely wrong about someone wasn't easy. "You want to know the truth?" Maria said, and her voice was steady now, confident in a way it hadn't been all evening. "Music doesn't care what job you have or clothes you wear. It doesn't care if you perform in fancy concert halls or if you practice on a keyboard in a tiny apartment. Music is about what's in your heart, not what's in your bank account." Victor nodded slowly, like he was really hearing these words for the first time in his life. "You're right. You're absolutely right. I had professors at Juilliard who told me I had a gift," Maria continued. "But you know what the real gift is? It's being able to find beauty in ordinary moments. It's being able to create something meaningful, even when your life doesn't look like what you thought it would." An older woman in an elegant black dress stepped forward from the crowd. "Excuse me, dear," she said to Maria, "but I'm Catherine Morrison. I'm on the board of the Chicago Symphony Orchestra." Maria recognized the name. Catherine Morrison was one of the most influential people in the city's classical music scene. Her support could make or break a musician's career. "That performance was absolutely stunning," Catherine continued. "I've heard that piece played by some of the world's best pianists, and I can honestly say that your interpretation was among the finest I've ever experienced. Would you be interested in discussing some opportunities with us?" Maria felt the world tilt slightly. Opportunities with the Chicago Symphony Orchestra? 3 years ago, that would have been her biggest dream come true. Now it felt almost too big to comprehend. I don't know what to say, Maria stammered. Say yes, Victor said quietly. Please, someone with your talent should be sharing it with the world. Other people started stepping forward then. A man who owned several music venues in the city handed her his business card. A woman who taught at a local music academy asked if Maria would be interested in giving master classes. A recording producer who had been dining with friends wanted to talk about making an album, but the conversation that meant the most to Maria came from an unexpected source. Tommy, the law student who worked as a server, had made his way through the crowd and was standing beside her with the biggest smile she'd ever seen. You know what you did tonight? He said, loud enough for everyone to hear. You didn't just play beautiful music. You reminded everyone in this room that you can't judge people by their job or their circumstances. You showed them that talent and dignity and worth have nothing to do with how much money you make or where you work. The crowd murmured in agreement, and Maria saw several people nodding thoughtfully. Victor looked particularly affected by Tommy's words. But most importantly, Tommy continued, you reminded yourself who you really are. You're not just a waitress who used to play piano. You're a musician who happens to work as a waitress right now. There's a big difference. As the evening wound down and the last guests finally left their tables, Maria found herself sitting at the piano again, this time with Victor beside her on the bench. The two of them talked quietly about music, about dreams, about the ways life can surprise you when you least expect it. I have a proposal, Victor said as they prepared to leave. I'm starting a foundation to help musicians who've had to put their careers on hold for family reasons. People who have the talent, but not the financial resources to pursue their dreams. Would you consider being our first scholarship recipient? Maria looked at this man who had gone from her worst critic to her biggest supporter in the span of a single evening. Why would you do that? Because tonight you taught me something I should have learned a long time ago, Victor said. Real artistry isn't about fame or status or playing in the fanciest venues. It's about having something genuine to say and the skill to say it beautifully. You have both of those things in abundance. 6 months later, Maria was performing regularly with the Chicago Symphony Orchestra while still maintaining a part-time job to support Diego. She had found a way to balance her responsibilities with her passion, proving that you don't always have to choose between family and dreams. Sometimes you can find a way to honor both. Victor kept his promise about the foundation, and it had already helped a dozen musicians get back on their feet. He had also learned to treat service workers with the respect they deserved, never again making assumptions about people based on their jobs. But the most important change was in Maria herself. She had rediscovered her voice, both musical and personal. She no longer saw herself as someone whose dreams had died, but as someone whose dreams had simply taken a different path than expected. And sometimes, when she was serving tables at the Crystal Ballroom before her evening performances, she would catch Victor's eye, and they would share a smile that said everything about second chances, about the power of music to change hearts, and about the importance of never underestimating the person bringing you your wine.